says you want to talk about the biology of being trans.
Yes. So I have a problem with it because I think that it feels to me, and I haven't looked into the subject a whole lot, but it feels to me like a person choosing to be something that they weren't biologically born to be is an issue.
Okay. But before I turn Forrest loose on this, because he's going to be much better at this than I am, I just want to ask a simple question. Are you aware that people are born with both sets of genitalia, are born intersex?
Yes, and I think those are special circumstances that are basically the percentage of that is almost not even a blip.
It's less than 1%, but it doesn't mean it's right. It's less than 1%, if I remember, at 1.5%. But if that's possible, then why wouldn't the rest of the biology be possible?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. The rest of the biology.
So if it's possible for a person, and it is possible, since people are in fact born intersex, why isn't it possible that? And when I say intersex, people are born with full sets of both genitalia and partial sets and everything in between. So why are you finding it hard to believe that trans people just are no different than intersex people who are born without a full set of genitalia?
Well, I think there's a glaring difference there, and that's why you're differentiating between someone who is not intersex and someone who is.
There is a difference, but it's not. I don't think it's as crazy as you think. So let me. I'm going to talk your ear off for just a second, Matthew, but I promise I am going to let you jump in here. I just want to give you a little bit of context from a biological standpoint, because the biggest thing here is that what you talked about at the very beginning. You said what they were born as biologically, I think is the way you said it, like their biological sex. The phrase biological sex is sort of just this stand-in for genitalia a lot of the times. That's the way that it's used, because when you talk to people about trans folks, when you talk about biological sex with them, what they often talk about is either genitalia or their chromosomes, specifically their sex chromosomes, aka their allosomes. If you're into that kind of language, it's fun. Whether you're XX or XY and so on and so on. The fact of the matter, however, is that number one, that's not actually how we define sex in biology. And number two, the way that we do define sex in biology doesn't work all of the time. Just like every single definition in biology, there's a whole bunch of holes, there's a whole bunch of caveats, there's a whole bunch of if and except and unless and until and all these different things. There are very, very few definitions in biology that are very cut and dry, and sex is absolutely no exception to that. So when we talk about what Jim was just saying about intersex people, having both sets of genitalia is just one example of that. There isn't just XX and XY. You could be XXY. That's called Klinefelter syndrome. That's 3 sex chromosomes. You could be X and nothing else. You could be XY and still have a female body. When we talk about, what these chromosomes are, remember, chromosomes are made of genes. And so you could have damage or changes to one or more of the genes on those chromosomes and have a completely different presentation no matter what your chromosomes say. Also, all those genes are doing is coding for proteins and hormones and things, and those have to bind to receptors on your cells in order to make your body do anything, and those cell receptors are controlled by totally different genes. So the language of genetics is in no way like simple or easy to decipher, anything like that. So one example that I gave recently, I made a YouTube video about this, and so this is just one that's off the top of my head, is, when you talk about genitalia, you talk about gonads. You, me, and everybody else on this call, everybody else listening to this, has the genes for both ovaries and testes. And there's a complicated genetic dance between your sex chromosomes to finally get you to where you are, wherever you are, whether you have one or the other or both or neither or half of one or half of the other. You can have an ovotesty, which is an organ that has tissue from literally both. It's craziness. And so you have all these different examples. And again, that's just talking about chromosomes, which has nothing to do with our definition of sex. The actual definition of sex in biology is the size of your sex cells, your gametes. If you have lots and lots of very small gametes, we call those sperm and we call you a boy. If you have very few big gametes, we call those eggs and we call you a girl. But there are species that produce more than just the two sizes. There are species that produce just one size. There are species that have both sizes within one individual. There are species that produce asexually. So what does this definition even mean in the grand scheme of things? The point is that when you throw around terms like biological sex, what you're actually doing is you're playing into, I wouldn't use the term a dog whistle, but a really, really myopic and parochial way of looking at the world that doesn't fit with actual biology. So when you throw around things like, oh, well, you were born biologically a male or biologically this or that, and you're choosing to be something else, not only is that a gross oversimplification of how these people actually feel and what they're actually going through, but it's also a misrepresentation of actual biological science. And unfortunately, that's something that isn't talked about a lot because why would you ever study that unless you wanted to become a biologist? Anyway, like I said, I was going to talk for a while. I have way more that I could talk about, but I want to hear your response to that and see if that helps in any way.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've never heard it explained quite that way. So from my viewpoint, I would think the vast majority, or I would think anyway, before you explained it that way, that the vast majority of people are born male or female, and then they don't feel like they're a male or female. And so then they take steps that we now can take in this day and age to change their outward appearance. But, and I'm not a biologist, so I'm probably wrong on this, but in my mindset, I was thinking, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Go and finish. I don't want to cut you off, but what you just said is important. I want to come back to it. So remind me, finish what you're saying.
Okay. So then in my viewpoint, I was just like, well, why do you have to redefine your entire being? Why don't you just be a dude that dresses like a girl and be okay with that? You know, because if you go into the emergency room and say my stomach hurts and I'm a male, or, you know, but then you have a uterus in there, it just seems like unnecessary confusion.
Right. Okay. So it's really important that you bring all of that up. Actually, I'm so glad that you said all of that. So first of all, I forgot to say earlier on when Jim was talking about intersex people, and he talked about people born with both sexes genitalia, all these different configurations of having different kinds of sex chromosomes all fit into what we call intersex, and the actual likelihood of that happening, the actual percent cases, is about the same as the likelihood of having red hair. So as many redheads as there are in the world, that's about how many intersex people there are in the world. Just so you know, it's not as rare as you might think. And lots of people don't even find out until like well into their life when they, for some reason, have a DNA test and they're like, oh shit, it turns out I had this situation going on. Anyway, and so what you talked about there, when you talked about someone who is, born a male, but they just don't feel like it, they don't feel this way or the other. There's a reason for that. One great example of that is that you have, I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty details of this because nobody wants to hear this shit, but there are structures in your brain that are dimorphic. So male brains look this way and female brains look that way. And it's not the dumb old, oh, men are smarter or whatever. These are patches of neurons the size of a grain of rice that are either a little bit bigger, or a little bit smaller, whatever. And we find consistently that trans people have brains that match their gender identities, not their genitalia. So it's not just that they woke up today and said, I think I want to be a girl today. It's that they literally have a woman's brain trapped inside, this, what you would call a male body. So it's a lot more complex than that. So when you're talking about why not just be a man wearing a dress and get away, there are some people that's totally fine. They just prefer the way that they look in dresses, and that's radical. I don't wear a dress because it's really breezy and uncomfortable. That is the only reason that I don't. And so, if I had a different opinion, I would probably wear one, right? But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about trans people. We are talking about women. This is not a man wearing a dress feeling like a woman. This is a woman who, may have had the body that she didn't want to have, but it's not just a man playing dress up. It's not a woman who feels this way or that way. So it's again, it's an oversimplification, but because I'm not going to get into a 3-hour lecture on all of this, but you don't want that either. But this is a woman who feels like a woman and is having to deal with the problems of having a man's body and being perceived as a man by, the people around her. as far as medicine, which was the last thing you brought up, and I'm so happy you said that at the last moment there, talking about, if you go to the hospital and you say, hey, I'm a woman and I'm here to do this, and then they, lift up her skirt and they're like, oh, well, you clearly don't have a uterus, so what are we supposed to do with you? This is why there's such a push for trans acceptance and trans visibility now. And this is why there are so many biologists that are trying to talk about this stuff, because the simple fact of the matter is, just like with our definition of sex, it doesn't function. And that's fine. In biology, that's fine. The same way our definition of species doesn't make any damn sense either. And that's fine in biology because we know how to work around it. But when you're talking about the general public, that can kind of get sticky, because now there's legal issues and there's medical issues and there's, sometimes moral and cultural issues that come along with this. So the big push here is just to identify the fact that, number one, sex and gender are completely different things. Gender is a social construct, not a biological one. You can't reduce down gender norms to biological sex, nor can you predict gender norms from biological sex. So these are very different things. Not one of them is a binary. Neither sex nor gender are binary. And the way that we perceive these things in our culture simply don't work. You cannot boil down almost 8 billion human beings into 2 boxes. It just doesn't work out that way. And so we need to have a serious adult conversation about how we want to treat these people and how we want to move on forward, re-identifying the way that we categorize people, or if we want to even categorize people at all. And when we talk about groups like this that have been historically marginalized and ignored and disenfranchised, I think it's really important to remember the phrase, nothing about us without us. It's their choice how we should be talking about them, treating them, working with them. It's their choice to give us instructions on how they want to be talked to, the same way that you and I would expect to have a public civil discourse. And that's kind of the direction that we're trying to move this in now, is where do we go from here now that we realize things aren't nearly as simple as we once thought they were, because nothing in biology is basic biology. Where do we go from here? Does that help answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, that's great. You brought up a good point too, that I was talking to the call screener about. You said in the same way that in biology, differentiating between male and female works, but not in social. But then you said it's the same thing as species. So I did have a follow-up question. What do you think about people? I've seen reports of people that literally feel like they are a different type of animal, so then they get major transformation surgeries and things like that to look like that animal and live out their life like a lizard or whatever. Isn't that sort of on the same? Oh, it's different, but it's sort of on the same plane. Do you think do you give the same freedoms to them socially as you would a male or female thing?
So I think it's really important to point out the fact, and I'm not calling you out here, chastising you. I want to be very clear. I think you have good intentions asking that. But
okay. I have a thick skin. You're not going to hurt my feelings. It's fine.
Well, I just want to be clear that I don't think that I think that you're well intentioned in asking that question, but I think it's really important to point out the fact that conflating those two things is detrimental, because when we're talking about trans people, we're not talking about psychosis. We're not talking about a disorder. We're not talking about anything like that. We're talking about, there's a reason why gender dysphoria and this such are not considered the same thing psychologically today that they were 30 years ago. But when we talk about somebody who is, wanting to, be a lizard or whatever you're talking about like that, I think that is on a completely different playing field. I would have the same argument of just like, as long as you're not hurting anybody and it's you and however many other consenting adults, who gives a shit? Like, I would have that same philosophy, but I would have that same philosophy for a completely different reason. And honestly, you know what? I would view that specific situation the same way that I would with tattoos, piercings, or whatever else. If it makes you happy and you're not hurting anybody else, do whatever you want to do. There's that guy who's turning himself into the black alien, cutting off parts of his hand and his nose and all those things. If he's happy and he's doing what he wants to do with his own body, let him do it. That's radical. But I do want to make it sure to really clarify the fact that, the argument that usually comes out of what you just said is transracial, trans species, trans whatever else, is to diminutize and to make a joke out of being transgender, and that they cannot be compared in this way.
So I wasn't obviously, like you said, trying to.
I didn't think you were. That's why I was trying to make sure to say at the beginning. I think you were being good intentioned asking that, but I want to be very clear, because there's a lot of other people watching that you know, that those are not comparable, and there are a lot of other people who would use that example to be a dick. I don't think you are. I just want to make sure to make that clear for the rest of the audience. You know what I mean?
So to be clear, you would not give somebody who felt like they were a lizard or felt like they were black and they're actually white, like you said, you wouldn't give them the same thought process as you would the male versus female issue. Then
no, they would be in completely different playing fields. It would be a completely different conversation, completely different reasons, because concepts of species and concepts of race are completely different than concepts of gender, biologically, socially, all of the above.
All right, cool. That makes a lot of sense. That was a great talk. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to me ramble, Matthew. I appreciate your patience.